This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 240 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Robert Schott, Director of Tree Operations at KC Trees, about the best choices for urban trees. The plant profile is on basil, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with a last word on the Great Tomato Adventure by Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Robert Schott. He is the Director of Tree Operations at KC Trees in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Rob.
Hey, Kathy. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the GardenDC podcast. We're going to be talking all about urban trees and some great selections maybe for home gardeners as well to add more trees to their home landscapes. But before we get into all that, Rob, let's talk about baby Rob. And were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
That's a fun question. You know, I grew up in Glen Echo, Maryland, so I spent a ton of time down by the river, swimming, kayaking, climbing on sycamores and swinging in. I didn't do a ton of growing of plants per se when I was very young, but I'll say this, and then I believe the Shimizus, Holly and Osamu, and my neighbor Bevan Shimizu lived right up the street. And what I'll say is that they have a wonderful garden in Glen Echo, and I spent a lot of time there, and I always recall just this aura and this sense of the space and how it was like magnetic. I always wanted to be there. I always wanted to engage in it. And through that experience and spending time in forested lands, along the river and at Valley Mill Camp in Poolesville, just constantly being drawn to certain spaces. And I think that led me to, mowing lawns and mulching beds when I was in, 8th grade through probably 12th grade, and then getting jobs working at golf courses, kind of a lifestyle that I think engaged me a bit. And after college, getting involved working for a landscape architect, and then going to Longwood Gardens professional horticulture program, and just everything precipitated from there. So it wasn't that I grew up growing a ton of plants, but it was this draw towards being in certain spaces and how, something inside me, it made me feel a certain way, and just constantly being drawn to that. And I think it's how I've landed where I am, and being fortunate enough to be chatting with folks like you on plant podcasts.
And Rob, you are so lucky to have grown up with the Shimizus as your neighbors. And Holly Shimizu is a friend of the GardenDC podcast and a past guest. And she is such a font of gardening knowledge and plant love. And so you got off to a great start.
I know it. I count my blessings.
And so let's talk a little bit about KC Trees. So we've had a colleague of yours on a past episode of GardenDC. So Maddie Hoagland Hansen spoke about invasive plants on episode 181 of our podcast, and she is the horticulturist on staff with KC Trees.
Correct. Yeah, Maddie's super talented. KC Trees, urban forestry nonprofit in DC. Mission to restore, enhance, and protect the tree canopy of DC, and we do that through advocacy and policy, education, but a lot of tree planting. And I've been at KC Trees for 7 years. About 3 years into it, DOE, Department of Energy and Environment, had reached out to us, and we have this big backlog. Would you guys be interested in doing a garden work? And being a student at Longwood, it was super interesting to me. But, myself and maybe one other colleague really had horticulture gardening experience. And so we opened up the position, and Maddie's been on our team for 3.5 years now. Very talented landscape architect, knows her plants, great design aesthetic. So fortunate to have her, and she had a great podcast session, and just excited to have that scope of the work we do, because I think there's so much between the overstory, the understory, shrub layer, grasses, forbs, ferns. So it's fun to be able to do the whole ecosystem, and something we're continuing to build upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Rob, there's such a funny thing where people say plants and trees as if trees aren't plants.
I know what you mean.
So it's like this whole separate, just because they're above your head doesn't mean it's not a plant. But we just, in garden writing and communication and just, one gardener talking to another, we just habitually say plants and trees.
Well, and just one thing to add to that, and I think it's interesting, you see it certainly in urban environments, is the lack of healthy understory and herbaceous layer
Mm-hmm.
allows these invasives to come in, and it really threatens the overstory as well. And so it's so important to see all the layers and have a healthy forest and ecosystem throughout, or else you don't get that regeneration. You get ivy and things growing on trees, choking them, and then the forest slowly degrades. And frankly, not even that slowly. You see it within decades and a lifetime. And so it's very important to have sort of healthy from that herbaceous layer all the way to the overstory.
So true. So can you tell me a little bit about what a director of tree operations does?
Sure. So, the tree operations team is about 30 folks. We have our field technicians, which essentially, many of which are certified arborists, but, they're out in the high vis, they're planting trees, they're pruning trees, watering, they're installing the gardens, and they're sort of, they're like front of house and back of house, they're the ones seeing folks, but also kind of the cooks in the kitchen, if you will. And there's about 15 or so on our team currently. Then we have our urban forester team, who is a bit sales and development. They're reaching out to homeowners or National Park Service or departments of Park and Rec, and they're designing the projects, and then ultimately those get installed. So we have 7 urban foresters and someone managing them. And then we have, a lot of the work we do is grant funded, which we're fortunate to have. A little bit of a challenging climate currently with funding and things along those lines, as I'm sure all the listeners are aware of.
Mm-hmm.
But we're fortunate to have a lot of grant funding. And with the grant funding, folks who provide funding want to know where the trees are going, where the gardens are going, et cetera. So we have a data services team, which they run our GIS system. They also help with our CRM system, Salesforce. So they're doing a lot of the unseen work that's so important. They're also allowing us to target areas with lower canopy or lower socioeconomic status. So a lot of our work is focused in certain arenas, and that's part of the grant funding. So we have 4 folks on that team as well, couple managers, and then we have our horticulturist and landscape architect, Maddie, and that builds a team. So it's everything from going out, working with my colleagues to find funding, which is certainly something that has sort of spiked in need in the last, call it 2025. But, I have so many talented folks that are carrying through so much of the work. I'm not getting out and swinging the pickaxe and throwing the shovel in the ground as much as I would love. It's kind of how you get into the industry and then start managing and you get a little bit withdrawn from it. I still get out there, no doubt. But I have so many good folks. I mean, I feel like a big part of my role, Kathy, is really curating and cultivating a team and just putting people in the right place to succeed and really to thrive. And so I think a lot about my role as really cultivating a team, all the human capital we have, and putting folks in the right position to increase canopy, put in native pollinator gardens, etc.
And for those in the Washington, D.C. region, we're known as a city of trees for a good reason. And of course, the D.C. government is maintaining some of those trees, federal government and private homeowners. And then KC Trees is supplementing that.
Indeed. And I will say, I mean, we have so many partners and so much talent throughout DC. Urban Forestry Division, part of District Department of Transportation. They, I believe, have, 175,000 trees in their inventory, which, includes all the right-of-way trees. That's their bread and butter, so to speak. But they ultimately manage trees on school and parkland as well. And then MPS does a fantastic job. Department of Parks and Recreation, they have a lot of work that they do. And we work closely with all of them to generate and find leads, work alongside them to pick the appropriate species for those locations. And then so many homeowners. I mean, that's one of our big grants is through DOE and Urban Forestry Division to plant on residential land because there's so much residential land and it's, it's sort of deemed safer, if you will. You never know when a park or a school is going to get raised for new development. So residential work is a big part of what we focus on. And so we get funding from the government because they're, precluded from working on private residential land. And so they give KC Trees funding so that we can continue to increase canopy, work towards that 40% tree canopy goal by 2032. And, we're making a lot of headway, but there's constant development. So we still have about 2.5% to get to that 40%. So a big part of what we do also is advocacy, policy, protecting the trees that get to maturity, because those are the most impactful.
It's interesting that you say that the home owners, the private land, is a little more secure than the public land, because I would have thought the opposite. You see a new homeowner come in and take out all the trees or expand the home and take that out. Whereas I would think on a public property, everybody has a vested interest in those trees, at a local park, at a local school, that sort of.
I started at KC Trees 7 years ago, and to me, it was a fascinating, a fascinating thing to hear. And I'll just mention a big part of what I alluded to was the policy piece. Is there's restrictions on, you can't just take down trees to create an auxiliary dwelling or a new garage or something along those lines. So that's a really big piece of protecting our canopy. But it's also just, there's so much residential land that if we weren't pushing towards, I think, and advocating towards and doing that business development and that community outreach, they may not be putting trees in, whether it's, they're priced out or it's not top of mind. And so it's not just that they're protected, it's that the public lands, I think there's more advocacy for them, perhaps, that there's more, government programs to put trees on those lands, where that may not happen on the private residential land, which is what makes it such a big target for all of us collaborating, NGOs and government agencies.
And so if I'm outside of the Washington, D.C. borders, in the surrounding community, does KC Trees extend to any of those?
Yeah, absolutely. We, our mission is to restore, enhance, and protect the tree canopy of Washington, D.C., but in the time I've been there, we've worked in Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Fairfax. We work in Arlington. We've done some work in Alexandria. More or less, our sort of self-noted boundary is more or less the Beltway. We've certainly done work outside the Beltway, but we have contracts with Hyattsville and Tacoma Park and College Park. We've worked with Mount Rainier. We work with Montgomery County Department of Transportation, Prince George's County Department of Public Works and Transportation, Fairfax County. So we have tons of programs all throughout the greater DMV, and we've really, generally almost rebranded because we do so much work. This last fiscal year, which is coming to an end in June for KC Trees, we're July 1 to end of June, we did nearly 50% of our work outside the district boundaries. Chesapeake Bay Trust grants, different municipal grants, contracts, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. Through the Forest Service, we had a lot of opportunities to plant in underserved communities all over the greater DMV.
Good to know. And for those listeners way outside the Washington, D.C. area, maybe in another country, overseas, how could they contact their local tree advocacy groups? Where would they find them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think just getting involved with folks like you and, local organizations, a lot of the lead generation we get are just from folks who, how'd you hear about us? And it's from a neighbor, from a friend. I saw something here or there. But I'll just also say, for what it's worth, I mean, we've done tree projects in Bowie. We've done tree projects in Frederick. We've sold trees. We have a farm in Berryville, Virginia. We've sold trees to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to Richmond. So our reach continues to grow. And, who knows, maybe we'll have a little satellite KC Trees somewhere overseas or further down in Virginia, hopefully.
Yeah. And also consider starting your own local nonprofit.
Yeah, no question. Just being involved with the folks that listen to podcasts like this and read literature that's, going to put them on the right trajectory. There's always folks that can lead you in the right direction. Specifically speaking, it's hard to know exactly where folks may be listening from, but I don't think it would take too many questions to try to find that small nonprofit or local community group that can put you in the right direction.
So let's talk about urban trees and some of our personal favorites, those that have withstood some of those trials that a lot of urban trees go through, which includes, pollution, root competition, I would say drought this last year or so,
Yeah, no
and
question.
other adverse effects. But then some trees flourish in those conditions. What are your favorites, Rob? Maybe we'll start off with ginkgo.
What are your favorites? How about ginkgo? I mean, that's like the OG tree, that goes way back. Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about sort of kind of laugh like urban warriors because all the conditions you alluded to, it's almost like a non-native setting, right? The mid-Atlantic, the native trees, you think of certain trees that are native but they'd have a hard time in urban settings, like a dogwood, perhaps. So they want to be dappled shade, nice loamy soil. That's not really what you find in urban settings. You can find that perhaps in a residential setting, but much more challenging in a right-of-way, a street tree setting between the curb and the sidewalk. So some go-tos for us, I mean, ginkgo is, again, a classic, does quite well. You see Quercus fellows, you see willow oak, all over the place. I think that one does quite well with confined root space, can handle dry conditions, but also wet feed if that's where it finds it. I mean, elms, that's kind of the stately DC tree. I think when I think about DC, it's elms and cherries. And we grow several different elm varieties. Jefferson is supposed to have a little bit of a better form than Princeton, but those DED, Dutch elm disease, cultivars, I think they're so resilient. They can handle so many different conditions. I will say elms for us, we really take a priority in structural pruning on elms because they can get leggy and they can have some tight unions and you can run into some trouble. But I'm making some subordination cuts and thinking about the branch aspect ratio and trying to curate good leaders. Elms are fantastic. Super beautiful, big leaves, big, awesome flowers, great fruit. You could probably go both ways. And some people may say they're a little bit messy, but catalpa's another just really solid urban tree that can handle really challenging conditions. And, we do water all our trees for 2 to 3 years. And then we're going to keep them on our pruning mat for about 10 years, trying to do structural pruning. Catalpa's a great one. A couple other oaks. Shingle oak is really resilient, does quite well in drought conditions. That's another solid one. Nuttall oak. I saw a talk from Bruce Friedrich he used to work at Bartlett Tree Experts, kind of a urban tree legend in Nuttalls, formerly Quercus texana, but Quercus natalii. They don't deal with a lot of kind of those standard oak issues that we see throughout the DMV, anthracnose, bacterial leaf scorch, hypoxylin, oak wilt. Nuttalls don't really get that, so that's another solid one. Robinia, perhaps a little weedy, but man, can it handle all kinds of conditions. Another Fabaceae would be honey locust. Those are some like real solid urban trees that we feel really good about, in the right spaces. But the other thing with urban environments is you have to think about some of the constraints. An obvious one that I think we think about are overhead wires. So those species that I just mentioned would conflict with wires. And so that's something you have to take into account when you're siting the tree. But certainly those 6 or 7 are very solid trees that I feel if for whatever reason we weren't able to water, Kathy, I would feel like they had the best opportunity to go thrive without that, maintenance effort from Casey trees.
And when you mentioned overhead wires, I wonder if Casey Trees is doing any advocacy in the city for having a lot of those wires buried.
Yeah, we are, and we've had those conversations. I think it's a challenging thing to do after the fact. I think in newer developments and things like that, you do see it. I lived in Bloomingdale for several years, and a lot of the wires in Bloomingdale are underground and or kind of bopping and weaving through the alleys. And when you drive through that part of town, you might not immediately notice it, but there is a ton of tree canopy because both sides of the street can have more medium to large canopy trees. And so you get a lot more of that impact, that shade coverage, just stormwater work that you'll get from trees intercepting water before it goes down into the sewer drains. But it's certainly something that I think with new developments has a lot of advantage. You're going to have to do a misutility ticket one way or another. And certainly wires underground would be great for tree canopy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. It's a big pet peeve of mine. We're doing so much utility work and installations and undergrounding a lot of other stuff that I'm like, why can't you do this at the same time? But yes.
Yeah, I hear it. And then you see so many mature trees that are thriving, but then have to be pruned by whether it's Pepco or someone else, so that if there are limb failures that, they're not affecting the wires quite as much, but you see pretty unnatural shapes at times, unfortunately. And I understand the rationale, but it would certainly be great for trees. There's no question.
Yeah. It's so tragic to see that giant L in the
I know.
the canopy
The big V.
Big V. Yeah. It's just, please, it's like, I know why you're doing it, but please don't do it. So if I do have overhead wires outside of my home in your tree boxes, what are some shorter stature trees that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, there's some classics that I think, folks would know, but Sweet Bay Magnolia virginiana is a really solid one that can handle a variety of conditions. A lot of those wet-footed species, I think, actually do quite well in right-of-way areas with compacted soil and some constrained volume, that anaerobic zone, that they're accustomed to with being wet-footed. Once they become established, they can handle that compacted soil, poor, maybe clay soil, because they can handle the anaerobic. So once you get them established, they do quite well. So in the same reason, I think sometimes it feels like an anomaly, but you see Platanus, London Plains and Sycamores doing quite well, even Taxodium. And I think it's for that ability to grow in an anaerobic environment, which you do find in lack of oxygen in the right-of-way situation. But most of those are overhead trees, but Serviceberry, is a good one that, again, once established. The one thing you'd have to note that working with municipalities, Serviceberry, Sweet Bay, sometimes they want to be more clump form, which is not always ideal from the municipal perspective, which I understand. So you got to get it up above 8 feet on the sidewalk and up above 14 on the road. So that's kind of an inherent challenge. The cherry trees can grow under the wires, but they're kind of stockier, if you will. They don't want to get up to 8 to 14 feet. They kind of grow wider earlier, so that can be a bit of a challenge on more major roads. Pistache is a non-native, but Chinese pistache does quite well in urban environments. Really beautiful fall foliage and cool fruiting, compound leaves. That's one that haven't seen a ton of invasiveness in being super seedy, but can handle the urban environment quite well. Redbuds are kind of a classic native tree that can handle the urban environment. There's been a little bit of nursery trade challenges with vascular streak dieback, fungal issue where you're seeing the leader dieback. Some of the cultivars don't have quite as much issue. Forest pansy, for example, when we had a couple challenges from our vendors, that one wasn't seeing the VSD. There's a couple, you see ironwood, Carpinus or Australia. Those can be really fun. They both have their own sort of fascinating bark that I think, again, once established, can do well under wires and really offer 4 seasons of interest. Those would be some good ones I would, kind of top of mind that I would advocate for.
Yeah, and I love redbuds so much, so I'm glad that you mentioned the vascular disease. And forest pansy is such a classic cultivar and pretty, I think, available.
Yeah,
in the trade still.
Available.
And of course, there's new redbuds being introduced, and some that can take more hot afternoon sun. They kind of have those more brilliant colors. They're more shorter in stature and more of a specimen plant. I would think some of those newer ones, though, would be a little pricey for me to risk putting out in the median strip or, the sidewalk hill strip.
Right. A couple others that just came to mind as you were talking, Yellowwood, as we're talking the pea family. Yellowwood's a great one. It can get up flirting with the wires, but you're not going to get big scaffolding branches out over them. So Yellowwood's one you see in DC quite often. There's tree form lilacs, which do well. I've seen fringe trees, which can be slow growing, but man, are they showy. That's another kind of fun one. Some cool trees that I think can do well in that right-of-way underwire area.
Yeah, and the fringe tree, you can choose your native option or the Asian version.
Yeah, exactly.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with you all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
What do you think about sweet gum as a street tree? I see that being selected more and more.
So sweet gum are really, I think awesome trees. I'm a big fan. They have like brilliant fall color. I think the biggest, typically for us, also something we take into account is the pruning needs. They hold that, excurrent growth for quite a long time. So they don't need quite as much structural pruning as you might see from an elm. Or an oak, which is nice because it's less input after the fact. I think the biggest question mark you see with sweet gum is always the fruit. There are some cultivars which are, I'll call them lower fruiting. Even Happy Days, you're going to see some fruits, but it's lower fruiting. I think, frankly, I would find sweet gums more offensive, if you will, when you're walking barefoot. I don't think it's that big a challenge for sidewalks or curbs, so to speak. But I know that when we work with municipalities, and even if the arborist from the municipality wants sweet gums, they talk about the homeowners and the community not being as excited about them. But I think sweet gum's a great tree. In many situations when we do them residentially, try to site them away from driveways and patios and things like that, and put it set back a little bit in the property or the garden. But I think it's a great tree.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think sweet gums are so beautiful. I love them in local parks. Probably wouldn't want it in my small urban garden, though.
I hear you.
It would be a lot of maintenance, which does bring up other fruit trees. So I get a lot of people asking me about gleaning and local fruits. And you mentioned serviceberry, of course, and ginkgo does have an edible component to it. But what about actively growing pears, apples, other fruit trees, either as street trees or as maybe a small orchard in a park somewhere?
Yeah, DC specifically in many parts of town, there, can be lower levels of grocery stores and things like that. So I think just from a standpoint of, that food desert component, orchards, things like that, I think it's awesome. I think sometimes fruit gets a little bit of a bad rap, so to speak. So I'm a big fan of it. I've, sort of ornamental, edible, so to speak. That was my senior thesis at Longwood, was kind of using ornamental plants that have this edible component. And I'm personally fascinated by it. One thing we do run into, Kathy, is a lot of the places that want it for educational purposes are schools and schools. We'll just call it that. And one of the challenges is that no one's actually around, or fewer people are around when the tree is fruiting. And during those maintenance months to harvest and to do those things. But there are some really cool organizations doing some really cool work. Ward 8 Well, DC Greens, Kelly Miller has a really cool garden. We planted some fruit trees there. I just think it's making sure there is that maintenance component, because no tree is a set it or forget it. No plant really is a set it or forget it. But I think fruit trees with, especially like proper kind of what we think about fruit trees, pears and apples and things along those lines, they often will have more pest and pathogen issues, and they do need a little bit more attention. So I think if you can provide that attention, by all means. But we often advocate for, native persimmon, serviceberry, pawpaw, things along those lines, which don't quite need the attention that you might get from an apple or a peach, the pruning you might need for an apple and a peach, but they provide that as well. Non-native dogwood, Cornus cusa, not everyone sort of loves that fruit, but I think it's a really beautiful ornamental tree, cool bark, great flowers, cool form, and you can do fun things with the fruits, even red buds. I taught my mother that redbud flowers were edible, and she was blown away, and she made a jam out of them. And, the pea family has a lot to offer in that component. So there's also kind of sneaky ways. Another thing we'll do with those food forest type ideas. Lincoln Smith from Forested does some really cool work. And, using some of the larger canopy trees that have those eco benefit and thinking about what they can provide. Nyssa sylvatica, Tupelo has, you can use those fruits for beverages, and certainly oaks and hickories, were long used for flour and things along those lines. So it can extrapolate a little bit beyond, in my opinion, just the fruit component. And they, all plants offer something. And so I think it can extend a little bit when you think about forested food forests beyond just the fruit. But certainly there's some cool native offerings as well.
Yeah, and I was thinking about crab apples the other day, because I had a crab apple that I loved in my garden, and I lost it to fire blight. It just, did great for a few years, and then it kind of hits that 10-year mark. So it does bring up some of the longevity issues with urban trees.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what you run into a little bit with some of the essentially understory species that you find under wires, that they just don't necessarily have that longevity, which is unfortunate, but just a bit of a reality.
Yeah, and I would think, getting back to some of the fruit trees and maybe even nut trees as well, is there's a lot of concern about rats and other pests being attracted to that. So again, that's part of the maintenance issue that you cited, and having good hygiene around those trees.
Exactly. And I will just throw out that everybody loves to, where there's a lot of funding for installation, very little funding for maintenance. And it's just the biggest part of cultivating a garden or plants is the long term. And I think that's kind of what you have to fall in love with to really have a long tenure in this industry, or many sort of plant horticulture, arboriculture, what have you, industry is that maintenance piece, and seeing the trees react to the pruning, and making sure you're tidying up or harvesting the fruit, or doing various things that may be seen as a nuisance, but it's really just part of what you're doing. It's the planting, or the pruning, and the maintenance is so big. The watering to allow the tree to survive and to continue to succeed. So the maintenance component that you mentioned is just always top of mind for us at KC Trees, because, what is a tree that doesn't make it through the summer drought? It's really trying to put it on this trajectory for success for decades and, hopefully a century. And so much of that is within the first 3 to 10 years of, 1 to 10 years, I should say, of the watering, establishment, pruning it to have success. And then that tree can really thrive for decades.
Yeah. And I hear you so much on the maintenance thing, because everybody wants to coordinate a tree planting, for their office type of, empowerment type of events and that sort of thing. And it's like, rah, everybody goes out and plants the trees, and then they never look at those trees again. So
I mean, you don't have to tell me, Kathy. You don't have to tell me. We're sort of starting to parlay some of these larger sponsored, which we're so thankful for, the corporate groups. I mean, it's such a big part of what we do, is getting the community working alongside of some of these great sponsors. We're starting to parlay into tree installation, and then that summer, or even if it's fall, that following summer, come out and see the tree that you planted, see how it's grown, see how much, even a yellowwood, which is a little slow, see how much growth it's thrown since April 1st, probably 12 to 18 inches, and sort of showing and cultivating that energy around this is a living organism. And I think it's starting to inspire groups and starting to inspire people. And it's been successful. We're kind of in the infancy of more of this maintenance group work and community events, but we're making some headway, and it's really important, and it's become impactful, and people are starting to get excited. And they planted a tree 2 years ago, and wow, like look how big this tulip poplar's gotten. This thing's grown 60%. Not quite doubled in a couple of years, but grown a ton, and they see it and they're just so excited. And so that's been a really helpful tool, so to speak, for us to continue that engagement piece, and more importantly, the maintenance of the urban forest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know one local corporate group I saw working at a park. All they were doing was spreading wood chip mulch around each of the large trees, the big oaks. And I was like, this is so great to see.
It's so good to see.
Yeah.
And we have a cool collaborative sort of symbiotic relationship with a lot of the arborists in the area, whether it's Asplund or Davy, Bartlett, and they'll deliver chips to our tree yard. And we use those chips to heal in our trees so that they can, stand up and not fall over in a wind event, or hold the moisture so they don't dry out. We also use those wood chips for our gardens. We use those wood chips for our trees. We do care events. We've created some trails through naturalized areas, and we use wood chips, and the volunteers love it. And I mean, there's really good evidence. I believe Linda Chalker Scott has a really cool article on arborist wood chips being the best mulch that you can use. And so it's not just a cool kind of upcycled full picture story. It's also a really effective mulch to use. There's a bunch of different size material, which helps to feed the tree. They last much longer than shredded hardwood. So it's mutually advantageous to use those wood chips. So super excited to hear that folks are out doing that. And, especially on mature trees, keeping mowers and such off of outside the drip line, and mitigating some of that compaction and root disturbance that you see often in parks when grasses and weeds grow around the trees, or there's string trim in the trunk. So it's important. There's no question.
Yeah, staying out of that root zone area. And I was thinking in particular about our beloved cherry trees around the tidal basin, and talk about compaction, Rob. Those tree roots. I was like, the thousands and thousands of visitors just, right up against the trunk of the tree, all around, picnicking, stepping on them. So there are things you can do to mitigate that a little bit, maybe some core aeration or that sort of thing.
Yeah, air spading, vertical mulching, those are all really good techniques. In some instances, I understand that that's probably not the most plausible or cost effective on, maybe an individual, but just keeping the mower away from outside the drip line, as those laterals start growing, essentially, but that kind of 1-to-1 of the roots are going to be, probably beyond the drip zone, but certainly out to it. So trying to mitigate that, or planting cool shade tolerant herbaceous, Pachyra, Heuchera. There's a variety. We could go on, but another fun way to really beautify your property, your garden, but also mitigate a little bit of that maintenance. Maybe you have to cut them back, once a year and weed a little bit, but instead of mowing that zone, 4 times a month for 6 months a year, it's less work and more beautiful and much better for the tree.
Well, as a big proponent of ground covers, you're singing my song.
Good. I'm glad. I mean, just certainly whenever we do that, we try to use plugs just to, you're not trying to put a 1 gallon necessarily in around a tree when you might be hitting some roots, and just be cognizant of your spacing and, making sure to not damage roots that are of, substantial size. But it's a really cool way to beautify the property and mitigate maintenance and again, really help that.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely am a big advocate for plug size, or if you can even do smaller, start some ground covers from seed or seedlings, if that's even better, working around tree roots. And it's so much more less work. Trying to dig in a gallon plant and disturbing all the roots and that sort of thing.
And it's funny. It's similar, Kathy, to like trees. You get a landscape architect, they always spec a 4-inch tree. And it reminds me, you put in, we grow 18-inch root bags. So give or take about a 15-gallon at our farm, 18-inch root bags. Give or take a 15-gallon. But, you see, if you put in a 7-gallon, Give it 5 years, that 4-inch tree is going to have lost so much roots at the harvest. If it's a B&B, it's going to kind of sit, build out its root biomass, and then it'll start to grow slowly. Whereas you put in a smaller tree, it's going to take off and catch up in 5 or 6 years. And the same thing happens. You put in a 1 gallon or, a plug, 1 or 2 seasons, and you're right there at about the same size plant material. And so it's cheaper, it's easier, more cost effective, less damage. I mean, just it goes on and on. In fact, on that note, out in Berryville, we're starting to grow, give or take, a 7 gallon. It's a root bag. So this is going to be above ground with added, soil media, but we're growing smaller trees because in some of the urban environments, it's challenging to get up a flight of stairs and through a gate and some of these things. And so we're actually growing a smaller crop that we think will probably catch up to our 15-gallon crop in several years. And so from a cost perspective, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love hearing the use of the grow bags for that. I think that's a perfect medium to be growing in, are those fabric root bags, and much lighter, as you said. The roots are much healthier when growing in those root bags because they get some oxygen exposure, and it seems like a win-win all around.
Well, it's fascinating because it was new to me. I mean, I'd worked in contracting, I had worked for landscape companies, designers, et cetera. And I mean, the amount of B&Bs I put in the ground, the amount of containers I put in the ground. What's cool about the root bag is essentially B&Bs, you're going to lose a lot of that root volume at harvest, and it's going to be, who knows, 200, 250 pounds. So the root bag and then a container. Let's talk about a container for a second. The roots hit the container and they take a left, they take a right, they go up, they go down. So you start to get this circling and this girdling effect. Whereas with the root bag, what happens with our trees is the roots go out and they hit the fabric and they create almost like a little node. And then it basically like air prunes itself, Kathy. So some of those roots that pop through the fabric, because it is porous, they will kind of constrict themselves, but you're losing much, much less biomass than you would with a B&B. And then the roots, when you put them in the ground, they're ready to go. Those nodes that when they hit the bag, they start firing off little feeder roots. And so, again, I'm biased in some capacity, but I'm also just anecdotally can attest to the product is really successful. And when you are working in an urban environment where you don't have necessarily amended soils and good soil, it's much more prone to success. And so the root bags they're just an incredible way to go. I mean, we use the native soil, really good soil, I will say, out at our farm. We're right on the Shenandoah River. So we have like nice alluvial, loamy soil, little sandy in areas. You get up the hill, can be a little rockier, but really good soil. And so we're using that native soil. And so when that tree goes in the ground, it's ready to roll and it takes off, where you don't always see that from B&Bs and from containers. It can be a little more stunted. So definitely a big advocate for the root bags.
Mm-hmm. And Berryville, as in Berryville, Virginia, for those listeners who aren't familiar with our Mid-Atlantic region, and B&B, balled and burlapped.
Yeah, sorry about the acronyms. I said a couple early, and I was really trying to spell them out for you. But yes, balled and burlap. And just another thing that's interesting. So B&Bs, we used to get about 80 to 90 B&Bs on a flatbed when we ship them into DC, and our tree numbers were comparable. So we would need 2 deliveries to equal what now we're doing. We're doing about 210 trees on a flatbed. We're able to double stack them. And so we're getting X the amount of trees on one tractor trailer. So the carbon footprint, is considerably lower, but also that economy of scale for us. I mean, we have a crew that takes a delivery, unloads them, heels them in, and then in about half a day. It was still taking us about a half a day, but we were doing 2.5 more deliveries. So we're much more efficient, much lower carbon footprint, much less truck diesel getting burned. So it's, again, just like really, biased, I realize, but I can't tell you enough how impressed I am and how happy I am with the root bags that we grow at Casey Trees.
And for the bags themselves, do you reuse them and maybe 2 or 3 years worth of life out of them, or how long do they last for you?
So the bags are grown in the ground, so they can last up to probably 5 or 6 years. We do take the bags off. Typically, the bags, you have to cut them So, and we're working with some different organizations, some different companies to try to find a bag that may be able to just kind of decompose. But I will say we're working with a couple different companies, and we're trialing out some new things, but we're using their bags are from 100% recycled plastic. So we'd really love to get to a place where the bags can biodegrade. And that would certainly be the best thing. I mean, plastic is just such an issue with, the entire world, but certainly in the horticulture, arboriculture industry. But I certainly feel much better about it than plastic containers, and knowing that it's coming from recycled water bottles, I think makes us feel much better. But typically, to answer your question specifically, the bags typically have to get cut. It's very rare that you're able to kind of pop it out like you would with a container, but we're always trying to improve. If anyone's listening and has a good lead on something, please let me know.
Excellent. And we talk mostly about deciduous trees in our suggestions and about urban trees, but what about some evergreen choices?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent for juniper. When you talk about, I'm surprised I didn't mention it with sort of the urban warriors as we have branded them, or so to speak. Junipers do so well. I mean, they can handle very, very dry conditions. They grow fairly quickly. Just a really good tree, in my opinion, native tree. See them kind of pop up all over the place. I mean, we've at times just kind of harvested them and repurposed them in different parts of plots. You see them under trees or along fence lines, from birds eating the berries. Holly's another really good one. We grow native Ilex opaca. Greenleaf. We also grow Nellie Stevens. Those are really good. I'm not a huge proponent of green giant hedges. So we try to kind of play into a more naturalized look. We even grow a sweet bay magnolia moonglow, which is not going to be a screening tree, but it does hold its leaves through the winter. Southern magnolia is another really good one. We grow two different southern magnolias, Magnolia grandiflora. We grow Bracken's brown, which is a more diminutive statured tree, also pretty cold hardy, which is nice because they're of a southern nativity, and that's just can be a bit of a challenge when you do have winters like we just had, but they're really good. And then we grow DD Blanchard, which is more of a, kind of that classic large magnolia. So those are good ones. What else? We grow Cryptomeria. Cryptomeria is a fun tree, non-native, but I'm a big fan. Cryptomeria japonica does have a little bit of challenge with really cold winters and really dry summers. So certainly in a garden standpoint, I think no problem. You can get your hose on it and it's a little bit more protected, but they can have some challenges with extreme winters and extreme summers. But those are some really good ones that we like to utilize. I'm a big Deodora cedar fan, just always have been. Something about their stature and the way they look, really Cedrus Atlantica too. Just cool cones, cool stature. I just love them. I have one in my garden. But those are some of the ones that we grow that I'm a big fan of, and that we typically, it's what we run across a lot with residents is maybe they love their neighbor, maybe they don't, but they don't always want to stare at their house or this and that. And so we try to kind of play with a more naturalized look rather than just, 7 to 10 green giants, because it's just not as interesting, not as much ecosystem offerings. And so we try to play with a little bit more of some of the native stuff.
And I was going to throw one out of left field at you, Rob, and that's the Dawn Redwood, Metasequoia. And that's, of course, a deciduous conifer, not an evergreen conifer. But because I live very near Shepherd Park and the border where there is an actual street of redwoods, Dawn redwoods, used as street trees.
I love them. I mean, maybe don't tell anyone. I might like them more than bald cypresses. Something about them. I have two in my garden, kind of flanking it. What at one point will become like a natural arch in my garden that I'm super excited for. I, only put them in 2.5 years ago when I got my house. But they grow fast. They're beautiful, incredible fall color. They need no pruning. I mean, they just talk about just X-current. Borderline set it, forget it with that one. I'm a huge fan. I think they're beautiful. But yeah, they do lose their leaves, which is why I didn't bring it up. But thank you for bringing it up because I'm a big fan.
Well, I was going to say they kind of overgrow their space a little bit. They are fast growing, but still pretty cool.
Yeah, very cool. No, they get big. You need to be cognizant of where you site it, and you do want a little space, but really beautiful, magnificent tree.
So how can our listeners contact you to find out more?
Well, I just want to say, Kathy, thank you for inviting me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and hope we can do it at a garden somewhere or over a coffee or something like that. But if anyone's interested in reaching out, my email is rshaut@kctrees.org. And if you're just, feel free to shoot me a note. But if you're interested in checking out KC Trees, our website is pretty intuitive and very helpful, kctrees.org. If you want to go specifically to sign up for a tree in DC or our other various programs, you can do kctrees.org/plant. And that'll take you directly to our intake. You can also find our gardens. You can see what we do for advocacy and sign up for community event. This is certainly the crowd that I'd love to see out in an event or chat gardens or trees with them. That's probably the best way.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Thanks, Kathy. It's been a pleasure.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the genius ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This episode is brought to you by Heyday. Feeling stressed? Take a moment for yourself with Heyday. Stroll through rows of golden wheat, tend to cute barnyard animals, and discover the joys of a digital farm retreat. You don't have to hop in a car or catch a plane. Escape to the farm at the tap of a finger. With Heyday, you're not just tending to a farm, you're tending to yourself. Heyday. Search Heyday, that's Hay space DAY, in your favorite app store. Heyday is a free-to-play mobile game and offers optional in-app purchases and random rewards.
Basil plant profile. Basil, Ocimum basilicum, is an annual herb in the mint family that is native to southern Asia. The leaves and stems are edible and highly aromatic. It's used as a culinary addition to soups, salads, sauces, and many other dishes. Cultivars of basil include Thai basil, Genovese basil, sweet basil, African blue basil, and many more. Newer varieties such as Prospera and Rucker's Obsession are bred to be more downy mildew resistant. Basil is very easy to grow from seed. Direct sow it in the ground or in a container as soon as the chance of a frost in the spring has passed. It can also be propagated by taking stem cuttings and rooting them in water before transplanting them outside. It is rabbit and deer resistant. Slugs, snails, and Japanese beetles can be an issue, so be on the lookout for these pests and hand-pick them off when you see them. Basil prefers to grow in full sun and in moist but well-draining soils. There is no need to fertilize it. It is hardy to USDA zones 10 to 11. Prune it regularly by pinching out the tips once it grows to about a foot or so tall. This will encourage lots of leafy full growth and discourage flowering. Towards the end of the summer, stop pinching it back and let it go to flower and seed. Pollinators go crazy for the flowers, and you can collect the seeds for sowing next year. Basil, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, we've had some terrific rains and some mild temperatures, so the weeds are booming and everything is looking lush and full. In my home garden, I'm enjoying the blooms on my herbaceous peonies, as well as those on the white and purple columbines. Over at the community garden, the borage is reseeding and the pollinator strip, along with some calendula plants, and that is starting to fill out nicely as well. In garden tips that we shared this week, it is International Compost Awareness Week. So composting was the topic of many of our tips in the previous week, including that if you treat your lawn with chemicals, specifically herbicides, that you should not add those grass clippings to your compost pile, nor use them as a mulch in your vegetable garden. And local gardening events, if you're in the Washington, D.C. region, I urge you to attend the Spring Garden Day on Saturday, May 17th at Green Spring Gardens in Annandale, Virginia. This popular event has many plant vendors of rare and unusual plants, including natives, edibles, and trees. Attendees also will enjoy local artists and on-site food vendors, as well as the Frogs, that's the Friends of Green Spring Gardens bake sale, which offers tasty treats. And the Green Springs' own Garden Gate plant shop will be open that day as well, and they are offering 10% discounts to Frogs members, of course. Washington Gardener Magazine will be there with a booth, and we hope you'll come by and say hi at our table. You can find out more about the Spring Garden Day at friendsofgreenspring.org. And then on Monday, May 19th, the Silver Spring Garden Club is hosting a talk on how to prepare an herbal tea, tisane, infusion, or decoction. Pat Kenny, our speaker, will sort out the differences between them. Pat Kenny is a longtime herbalist and will offer tastes of a few different herbal teas for attendees. If you'd like to attend, the meeting is free and open to all. Guests are welcome. It takes place at 7:30 p.m. at Brookside Gardens Visitor Center in the main auditorium, and Brookside Gardens is located in Wheaton, Maryland. You can find out more at the Silver Spring Garden Club's Facebook page or at silverspringgardenclub.com. And then on Tuesday, June 24th, the University of Maryland Extension and the Maryland Nursery Landscape Greenhouse Association is hosting a day honoring Stanton Gill. This will be a day-long symposium to celebrate Stanton. There will be morning lectures by Dr. Michael Brownbridge and Dr. Paula Shrewsbury on Stanton's research on biological management and IPM. And then in the afternoon, there will be an industry panel of individuals who worked with Stanton as their mentor. You can register for this event at mnlga.org.
This is The Last Word by Christy Page with Green Prints, a story by Valentine Maggetto called The Great Tomato Adventure, a hilarious tale of gardening gone awry. Gardening has always been my escape, a place where I find peace among the petals, but one summer, my serene sanctuary turned into a stage for a comedy of errors that still makes me laugh. It all began when I decided to grow tomatoes. I'd read all the books, watched the videos, and felt ready to tackle the challenge. I carefully selected my seeds, planted them in the best soil, and watered them religiously. Weeks passed and tiny green sprouts emerged. I was overjoyed. One sunny afternoon, I noticed my tomato plants were growing faster than I anticipated. Eager to support their growth, I set out to stake them. With a hammer in one hand and stakes in the other, I approached my flourishing plants. Little did I know, the garden had its own plans. As I hammered the first stake, it slipped from my hand and knocked over a nearby watering can, which promptly rolled down the garden path, creating a small, muddy river. Trying to save the day, I lunged to catch it, but instead, I tripped over the hose, landing face first in the mud. My loyal dog, Max, saw my tumble as an invitation to play and joyfully joined in, covering both of us in even more mud. Laughing at the absurdity, I stood up, only to find that one of my neighbors had witnessed the entire spectacle. She chuckled and offered a hand, saying, "Gardening is always an adventure, isn't it?" Despite the mess and chaos, my tomatoes continue to grow. Eventually, they bore fruit, beautiful, juicy tomatoes that tasted of victory and laughter. The garden, it seemed, had a sense of humor, and I had learned to appreciate the unpredictable joy it brought into my life. Every time I bite into one of those tomatoes, I'm reminded that gardening is more than just nurturing plants. It's about the unexpected moments that make our hearts sing, the mishaps that turn into laughter, and the stories that grow alongside our plants. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.